Good day, everybody. My name is Joseph Hand from Index Engines. We are going to begin in approximately 2 minutes. Good day, everybody. My name is Joseph Hand from Index Engines. We will begin in 1 minute. Hello, everybody. My name is Joseph Hand from Index Engines. Today's presentation is going to be on the competition and why we are different. This presentation is aimed at sellers of the CyberSense solution. With me on the call today is a gentleman by the name of Ed Moak. He is our VP of Professional Services. If you have questions during this presentation, you can use the questions box to put your question in. We will try to get to a lot of these questions during and after the presentation. Anything we do not get to on this presentation, we will answer via email. Without further ado, so what's going on out there in the wonderful world of ransomware? There's a lot of new trends that are, and unfortunately, new trends are not always good, right? In this case, with ransomware, it's, they're getting smarter, right? That's what it comes down to. Ransomware as a service is a very interesting proposition, right? So you think of software as a service, it helps people. It lowers your costs. It makes it easier to, ramp and get more customers. With ransomware, it's pretty much the same thing. So you have people that create ransomware packages and on the dark web make them available for somebody to come along and download. They then would just simply pay the royalty fees of whatever it is they harvest. And it's it's a very, very similar to, the typical software company model. But it does make it so that people without tremendous amounts of skills can get their hands on this stuff and get out there and start making money. All right. Next is the concept of worldwide conflict, right? So you have state actors that are getting involved in in their their geopolitical types of conflicts. So if think in terms of what's going on today in Europe and Asia, there are groups from Russia that are trying to hack into infrastructure all over the place, but mainly in Ukraine, right? So these are, groups of people that, similar to, the politicians, they feel they need to be involved. The next one is very scary, and that is the concept of partial encryption, right? So think in terms of, the typical way somebody would attack a system and encrypt all the files. Well, if they can do it partially and have the same effect, well, guess what? They can try and stay below the radar, and they can probably do things a little faster. Cloud-based software is also under attack. Things like Salesforce. So these are things you have to be cognizant of when you're building out an environment. They also happen to know that backup is pretty much your last line of defense. So what do? They target backup. They're getting smarter, is what it really comes down to. All right. In the past, when this all began, you had somebody double click something on their home computer, screen goes black, tells them they got to send some money in or pay by credit card or whatever, $300. They got smarter and they realized that there was a much bigger opportunity out there, and we have what we have now. Think in terms of that partial encryption thing. So Buy and Lion, it came out in the summertime, about mid-July. They pretty much target everybody. But what's unique about this is they go in and they try to evade detection, right, by partially encrypting pieces of the file. First things first, if you're not looking at the contents of the file, it's very difficult to detect. The other thing is because they're only touching a little piece of each file, they can do it much, much faster, right? So, in terms of the damage that they could do, is it goes up quite a few notches, right? So think in terms of, your file system with potentially tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of files, and a piece of them gets encrypted. Well, it's still unusable, right? Which reminds me of a famous quote by a famous comedian, right? It's very, very true with ransomware. So, what is CyberSense, right? So, real quick, a refresher on what we're here to do. Number one, we are the leading analytics engine, right? And by that I mean we can go into the content of a file, of a database, and look at it from every angle, as opposed to just looking at pieces of it on the outside. So we detect, we diagnose, and we can recover based on what we've found, right? So the idea behind it is to know that your data is good. And then if something does go bad, which typically always happens, it gives you the tools to figure out the who, what, where, and when, so that you can isolate it, control it, and fix it. So that's CyberSense in a nutshell. So let's look at the competition. We're calling this the surface, right? Because every one of the competitors out there are really only touching the surface, right? And what they do is it good enough, or is it leaving you open to attack? So the common methods of detection the typical surface view looks at are things like thresholds, right? So, do I have a tremendous amount of files changing or being deleted and recreated, or any number of types of changes that can happen to a group of files all at once? Metadata. So every file has metadata. Typical metadata that is looked at are things like the size, the creation date, when it was last modified, what the extension is, things like that. So Word doc files, or Excel spreadsheets, PDFs, things like that. There are other types of metadata that go for each type of file, but the most important ones that people look at are things like size and dates and things like that. So something that looks at metadata doesn't necessarily get an understanding of what's going on inside the file. If the file is damaged, the metadata doesn't necessarily tell you that, right? It just tells you the extension. But if you tried to read the file, you wouldn't necessarily be able to, if you have a tool that can actually read the contents, you can do a compare against what the metadata says the file is and what the file actually is or isn't anymore. System activity. This is not used by a tremendous amount of competitors, but there is one out there that does. And it's based on looking at, things like the CPU spiking, memory going up, disk or network access going through the roof in a particular pattern that would trigger the AI engine, machine learning engine associated with that to say, hey, there's potentially something going on here. And then lastly is signatures, right? So everybody knows what a signature is. It's been part of the virus scan world for years and years. You have a list of all of the things that are out there that can bite you and how they bite you. And if you don't have something, if you're missing something on that list, it can obviously get past it. Things like the new one, Buy and Lion, right, as a for instance, is something that just hit the airwaves, so it wouldn't have necessarily been in anybody's signature list. So it can get out there and it can do damage until somebody discovers it and then figures out a way around it and how the scanners can look at it. So digging into the competition, we'll start with Commvault. What type they use is based on the threshold and the metadata methods. Plus, they also have a feature called the honeypot. So it looks for things like number of files created, deleted, modified, as part of what it's going to try and figure out. Now, you'll notice the format of these slides where we talk about the competition, and every time I do these types of presentations, I always like to bring the receipts. So I have a screenshot of something from their documentation or their website or a blog post or something that kind of backs up what we're talking about here. So the process, they go and scan the backups and they compare them against historical backups, right? Just again, using their machine learning algorithm, and it checks to see if there is a dramatic change between today and yesterday from a number of files and what was created or deleted or modified. They also have the honeypot, which is something that they can deploy in the hopes that the bad actor will look at the honeypot and say, ooh, this is the thing I must attack, alerting them to the actual attack that's happening. Where it fails, again, it only touches the surface, right? It doesn't go into the content of the files or databases. Veeam. Veeam uses the system activity. So why do they use system activity? It's because necessarily all they have. All right. So from a systems perspective, they're operating at the virtual host level, and they're monitoring the virtual host itself. There is a utility that must be used in order to do detection, and that is something called Veeam 1. So Veeam 1 was originally designed to help you manage the virtual environment. So you get all kinds of different components that can look at trends and help you better organize your virtual environment for performance reasons, for just overall management. So what they've done, since they have all that data, is they've decided to use again, machine learning algorithm to look at the average operation and then compare it to what's going on at any given moment. So naturally, if a payload is executed from a ransomware bad actor, things will start to happen on these systems. And the idea here is by monitoring that, they can see when things start to spike and indicative of, could it be a ransomware detection or something like that? And then they will notify. This one is, again, playing only at the surface level of things. It doesn't look at files or content or databases. And it's, it's still part of that backup world. Now, one unique thing about Veeam is they've sort of been targeted by the bad actors, right? So there's a virus out called Noberus, and what Noberus does, they've figured out that in order for Veeam to discover and manage the virtual environment, you have to give Veeam the administrative level credentials for the virtual environment. So your whole vSphere environment, basically the keys to the kingdom, are now sitting in Veeam's database. And the ransomware bad actors have discovered this. So they hack into the SQL database associated with it. And not only do they have access to your Veeam infrastructure, but now they have complete and total control over your virtual environment, the entire virtual environment. So that's bad. You'll find most backup products are given some level of administrative level credential in order for them to do some of the things they do. In a lot of cases, they can isolate that to an individual host or system, right? Say the machine that's running the management portion of the backup software. But at the worst case, they could be embedding, Active Directory administrative credentials somewhere within that environment, and it is something to be fearful of. In this case, Nobris, well, they figured it out. On to Rubrik. Rubrik is one of the newer backup platforms. We've talked about Veeam. They've been around for a while. We've talked about Commvault. They've been around for a very long while. They've reinvented themselves a bunch of times. Rubrik is one of those products that's kind of been newer to the market, based on the fact that they understand the modern compute world is how they're kind of moving as rapidly as they are. They're able to basically understand everything that's going on versus your Commvaults, your Veritases that have been around since the 80s and 90s, and these products have become behemoths, and it's very difficult to move in any one particular direction, whereas Rubrik's been very lightweight, able to really take advantage of anything that comes along. So Rubrik is, again, using a threshold and a metadata type of scanning with entropy, right? So the process is essentially load up, your Rubrik environment, purchase your access to Polaris Radar, which is their cloud-based component. And then once it's enabled, it then creates, for every time it does its backups, it creates this file system metadata diff file. And then that contains basically the things that have happened during this backup. That gets sent up to Polaris, and it's analyzed for anomalies. Right? If anomalies are found, then Polaris Radar calls for a deeper scan, and that's where it reads for things like encryption and see if things have been encrypted. And then from the backup perspective, an entropy is calculated. It looks at the backup, not necessarily the individual files, where it then creates its entropy calculation. It only looks at the basic metadata fields like everything else, right? So when was the file last touched? When was it created? The size, things like that. And then, based on what it finds, it then says, okay, we have a potential problem. And once again, it only looks at the surface level of data. It does not support anything to do with databases. It does require additional hardware and software, which is very resource intensive. So in order for it to do all of this, you're going to be installing and managing a lot more costly hardware software to pull it off. It's only looking at the content from a backup perspective, not the individual files within. And then it looks for these anomalies. If the payload is designed to stay below that radar, like the newer generation, the Buy and Lions of the world, it may not be enough to trip the alarm. And then further inspection would not be called on. Once you've determined you have a ransomware infection, the next thing you have to do is figure out what backup is good. In order to do that, you need another piece of software that is their threat hunter, and that looks at the historical backups and compares them to what it's found now to help you find the appropriate backup to recover. Right. On to Cohesity. Another one of the newer products that are out there. Again, Cohesity is kind of taking advantage of the fact that they're lean and mean and can, support new things rather quickly. As far as the ransomware world is concerned, they're probably one of the more weaker solutions. They're threshold only. It does require another add-on, something called Helios, and it looks at the backups for anomalies, for change anomalies. That's it. Um, Frequency of file access, number of files modified, added, or deleted. Again, it's a surface only type of product, and it does not do anything to do with metadata of files. It doesn't use signatures, and it does not do any kind of content whatsoever, including databases. It does not touch databases. Lastly is NetBackup. NetBackup, again, has been around since, probably the late 80s. They are threshold based, and they also added the ability to use signatures to do scans. It does require, yet again, another piece of software and NetBackup IT Analytics. This is like the Veeam 1 tool. It is designed so that you can look at your environment and better manage your backup environment. It also does things like, figuring out if you have systems that are not being backed up by a policy. It does require the agent be installed on that system, but for some reason you forgot to, add that system to the list of machines that are being backed up. This will notify you. What it does is it looks for anomalies within the data protection operations, right? So let's say this backup is now larger, or this backup contains more files, or within it, more files have changed, right? So it's not looking at anything to do with your day-to-day content. With the signature, though, however, the NetBackup IT Analytics can actually be targeted to a primary data source and scanned for known ransomware based on what the signatures hold. Where it fails, once again, it is a surface only type of scan. It does not look at content, metadata, or databases, and it is limited to only anomalies that are found within the backup operation, not the actual data. So in a quick overview, obviously, the goal on charts like these is to see as little red as possible. In this case, it's just, a quick summary of what these products do, how they do it, and the fact that they really don't look at content or databases at all, none of them. So let's talk about that surface level. Right. So think in terms of, all of these products that are out there. Most companies have a backup product, right? By now, and if they don't, they're not right. But backup is looked at as that last line of defense. But if that last line of defense is only looking at that surface level of what's going on out there, there's no way that they could actually see beyond and potentially help you in your time of need. So think system activity thresholds, signatures, metadata, scans, things like that. They're barely touching the iceberg. There's a little bit more that needs to be concerned with, right? So what is CyberSense? Once again, CyberSense looks at the full content. It goes below the surface, right? It reads into the page level of databases. Everybody claims they have machine learning. Our machine learning is not based on 10 to 12 different data points. It uses hundreds of data points to make its determinations. Now, the more important part of this presentation is, figuring out how we can beat the competition and make sure that the customers have the best chance at success. All right. So let's define the market. In order to define the market, you have to pretty much kind of call it what it is, right? I like to create this level of discussion when I'm speaking with actual customers that allows me to take every one of my competitors and put them in the same exact place. In this case, they're all only at the surface of your world, right? They can only see at the surface level. Whereas what we do kind of goes below that, right? We go below to where all the data actually sits. So the competition being at the surface, they only see things like metadata, thresholds, and statistics of the actual systems. They can scan for signatures and extensions, right? So if like, they were able to see that every one of the files in the file system were renamed to have the extension WannaCry or fun or something like that. Those are obvious attacks. But at the same time, we know that the industry of ransomware is going in the opposite direction, and they're looking to try and evade detection as long as possible, because they know that the more they evade, the more they can touch and the more they can lock down your world and make you pay, right? That's their goal. None of them can actually see inside of databases. And again, machine learning, everybody claims they have machine learning, but, they're not all created equally, right? So every one of if you turn on the news, you see, companies being called out all the time. This company was attacked, that company was attacked, this government arm was attacked. What is it, if you look at every one of those companies, do they not have any kind of like edge level protection, server level protection, things that they spend potentially millions of dollars on to help them prevent what's going on or what is potentially attacking them, right? The common denominator is every one of them has solutions in place, right? Yet these people get through. How do they get through? Well, sometimes, it's Bob in accounting, not, remembering that he was told he shouldn't double click on the file that came in his email that, it's supposed to be something funny to view or whatever, right? These are the entry points. Sometimes they actually pay people to help them get in. The point is that, they get in, right? And the last thing anybody wants to do is appear on the nightly news. So again, you have to kind of differentiate ourselves from everybody else, and that's pretty much what the surface only is all about, right? It helps us say, these products that are out there, you have some of them already. These products can only go to a certain point, and when you're looking at your last line of defense, right? When you're looking at how do I recover when everything else failed, you have to have 100%, a surety that that data is going to work. Otherwise, you're paying the ransom. Right? Think about machine learning, right? When you're talking about, an algorithm, right, that helps you do things. Think in terms of, the data sets that you could possibly gather. A human can only like process a specific amount before their brain kind of melts and they really can't do any more. Whereas, computers can take that algorithm and analyze points of data. The more data you feed it, the more capable the algorithm is. So again, machine learning, everybody claims they have machine learning, but again, it really is what you feed it. Think in terms of like using your iPhone. Your iPhone can, look at you for a tenth of a second and make a determination that you are who you say you are, and it can unlock your phone, right? It can hold your passwords and unlock different applications, right? That's, the benefit of machine learning, right? So think in terms of if you have machine learning that's only looking at 10 to 12 data points, and maybe the color of your eyes, maybe the tone of your skin, right? The shape of your nose. That's all it has to go by, right? So think in terms of having to try and figure out whether or not it should unlock. And in this case, should that cat allow Steve's phone to be opened, right? So again, machine learning at the surface only gives you based on what you feed it, right? So if you're only giving it metadata, if you're only giving it thresholds, right? If you're only monitoring system activity, what you're giving up is that level of precision, right? The iPhone looks at literally thousands of data points to determine whether you're you or not. In this case, if you're looking only at a couple of things, how do you know, right? How do you know you're not seeing false positives and false negatives? And when you get a lot of these, typically you get a complacent staff that does not follow through on all the alarms, and your risk goes through the roof. Once again, we know that they are getting smarter. So machine learning from a CyberSense perspective, right? We have over 200 points of data that we analyze and look at every time we look at a file, a database. We look at all the pages on the inside. Then we take that and we put it against a database that has been literally trained on tens of thousands of data points, thousands of different malware that's out there. Everything and anything. We feed that through the engine so that we can make a determination that is accurate, right? In this case, we see 99.5% level of confidence, right? And we can very easily determine what's going on in the environment, whether it was user related or whether it's ransomware, right? And the goal of this is when you finally do get a notification from CyberSense, you know that something is going on in that environment. So let's talk about, why the full content and all of these analytics are critical, right? So the backup captures data, right? All of these changes are then analyzed. When we think of what changes those are, we think in terms of, everything that goes on in that environment day to day, right? Snapshot to snapshot, backup to backup. We have to look at, pretty much that entire list of analytics, because what we're missing, right, if we're only looking at the surface, is whether or not partial encryption happened, right? Whether or not, a user changed a bunch of files, right? We have to determine what is obvious, right, and what is not. Right. The less obvious stuff is that middle piece that will create false negatives, and then naturally, if there's enough of them, people tend to ignore them, right? It could be, catastrophic. So, in that midsection, what we look for are those things like partial encryption, right? Slow corruption that happens, again, to hide itself underneath the radar, right? File extensions that, don't change, but the inside does, right? A lot of different things can happen, right? Users can delete files. Right? I do that all the time. I have a bunch of stuff. I have it in this location. I copy it someplace else and delete it. Well, guess what? That can trigger an alarm. So we have to know what the difference is, right? And that's where CyberSense can come in and really give you that advantage. So every time you go out and you meet with potential customers, right, we have to, obviously give them enough data about our solution, but we also like to, talk to them about what else they're looking at. And in the case of, whether or not it's going to be good enough, right? Well, our backup software is immutable. Well, guess what? It's software based, and software can be hacked, right? Is my data, going to be safe and scanned? Well, guess what? If you're only doing this at a level of the surface level, things like that can get past you, right? Can you look at a DBA in the room and say, what are you doing, right now to make sure your databases are protected, right? And will the software that you're thinking of using, if you're not looking at CyberSense, what will it do for you, right? So you should be armed with these types of questions when you have these conversations, because in reality, none of the competition can answer these in a way that should allow people to, A, sleep at night, and B, make a competent decision, right? So let's talk about some common sense kind of stuff, right? Almost every competitor out there, whether it's a backup vendor or a disk vendor, they all have some form of immutability, right? Immutability is great, but it's not, it's not a solution. It's part of a solution. If it's software based, it can be, hacked. If it's, a hardware array that uses a software interface to manage it, it can be hacked. There are a couple out there that you can actually lock it down to a point where even the administrators at that company can't make changes, right? And that's great. But again, unless you're actually looking inside and looking at the data in that immutable snapshot in a way that gives you that 100% level of confidence that you can actually recover, then it's all for nothing, right? Every type of detection that all of the competition use all have some form of fatal flaw. Metadata scans, they can only look at very few data points, very few specifics that you can basically base a decision on whether or not you have an issue, right? Versus what we do, where we're looking at over 200 points of data within that file. Threshold scans, they only look at mass change. So if you're being attacked by something that can only look at that surface level and does not try and make mass change to a file, well, it can get past it. System activity, right? It's great, but what happens if your company decides to have some kind of sale and all of a sudden you're getting a lot of transactions? That's going to cause system activity to go up. That will create false positives or false negatives and set off alarm bells. And it's not necessarily looking at the actual data to see what's going on. And signatures are only great if they're defined. If something new has hit the waves and is coming ashore at you'll want to know whether or not you're protected. And if you have not had this defined yet, well, guess what? You're not. It's plain and simple. Right? They know that you're going to deploy tools, right? That's the other thing, right? Every one of the companies out there has edge-based tools to prevent these things from happening that all get circumvented. What makes you think that your backup environment is safe, right? Especially now that they know that if you have data that's valuable, you're probably backing it up, and they're going to want to make it so those backups are not usable. All right. The other thing that's common sense that people don't necessarily understand is your backup environment is part of your production data environment. Right. And that should be a massive red flag for everybody out there. Right. So think in terms of I'm a Rubrik customer, I'm a Veritas customer. Yes, I've got my backup servers sitting on my production networks so that they have access to all of the systems that need to be backed up. And guess what? Yes, I am going to give them all of the high level credentials so that they can do their jobs effectively. Well, yeah, okay. Now that they're sitting on your production network, and the bad actors out there know you're using them, well, they know where their first stop is to prevent you from being able to recover. CyberSense is the only one that goes below the surface, right? This is a tool that you have in your tool belt that you should be able to walk into any customer with confidence and let them understand that this is the only tool available on the market today, and you happen to be the one that sells it, that can actually look inside your data and determine whether or not that data is usable. Right? Again, it's not just looking at the surface. It's looking very deep inside at, again, over 200 points of data about a particular file. It can look at databases. It can look at, you think in terms like an Oracle database. Oracle database has a tool called DB Verify, and that will look at all of the pages inside a database to make sure they're good. But can it look for corruption from ransomware? It has no clue about that. Right? So it's not necessarily protected. It's just giving you the ability to fix things or know that you've got some kind of corruption in your database. But can it look at a list of over 200 different points of data and then compare it to potentially millions of scans of knowledge that has been accumulated by CyberSense and the machine learning algorithm that it uses? So things in terms like partial encryption, right? That new strain, we actually tested that without making a single change to the algorithms, right? And we saw it. based on the fact that, we can actually see within the file. Again, this was this was a test we ran inside CyberSense labs and said, this thing will probably get right past us. Nope, we found it, right? Without a blink, we saw this thing. And it only looks at a file and makes minor changes, partial encryption, to make the file unusable. We're outside of the production environment. So in most environments, you're building it as an air gap type of solution where you're feeding the data to us, via some kind of air gap. But again, we're only looking at the backup as presented to us, scanning it, verifying it, and giving back the feedback that everything is either good or not, right? We are not part of the production world, and therefore we stay below their radar. Right? Full content-based analytics is literally the only way to make sure your last line of defense works. So this is the end of the presentation. We just want to let you know, if you have further questions, you can always send us an email at info@indexengines.com. We're available also on the web. And then typically within, an hour or two after this presentation, you will receive an email from Index Engines Marketing, which will have a link to this webinar. You'll also get a copy of our latest white paper, The Power of CyberSense's Machine Learning. And then you'll also get a invitation to our next webinar, November 7th, with the launch of CyberSense 8.0. We've got some great new things coming in the product. Some of you have seen, some of the good stuff that's coming. We have a brand new web-based interface that will kind of make it so that you have all of your post-attack workflow in one view. It's completely customizable, gives you a very clear understanding of what's going on in the world of your data and where you're being attacked from and how. With that, we can open it up to some questions. We'll ask Ed to come on and maybe we can jump in and if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the questions interface. And Ed, I'm gonna invite you over to the stage here to say hello.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Great presentation. I've been busy trying to answer all the questions on the chat. So if anybody has any other questions, can we see hands being raised or anything like that? Oh, I got a hand raised somewhere here.
All right.
David Valentine's got his hand raised, but I can't seem to open his mic.
All right, let me find him here. David Valentine. I think I've unmuted you, David.
David, you got a question? If not, if you could unmute Jordan Tabor, we'll take Jordan's got his hand raised as well.
Okay.
Jordan? Are we actually unmuting? I don't see Jordan Tabor's mic being unmuted.
Yeah, I'm actually, there he is. Jordan,
hey,
go ahead.
You guys hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. Earlier in the presentation, it was mentioned about the intense architecture required for Rubrik to run radar. I'm assuming that there's probably similar infrastructure bloat when we're talking about cohesity, and just as we're having conversations in the field, it would be really helpful if we understood specifically what the architecture is required by Cohesity and Rubrik to run their anomaly detection tools.
Sure, and that is something that we can probably put together as a follow-up for this. I unfortunately now don't have access to, but yeah, we can make a note and possibly put together a little white paper or something like that.
That'd be great. We routinely do reverse architectures when competing against competitors, so that piece specific to infrastructure required around anomaly detection would be really helpful. So thanks for being willing to do that.
Yep.
Okay. Jordan. Another one here. Hold on. Roger Berkeley. You can unmute him. He has his hand raised.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, thanks. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the actual training up on CyberSense to get it up and running and how it adapted learns.
So let me talk a little bit about, so we are not adaptive training. CyberSense is not adaptive on site. CyberSense is trained in our labs, and what we do is we've got a subscription to the latest organizations that post ransomware, that identify ransomware, as well as academia and government agencies to get notified of new ransomware. And we use that ransomware. We'll download that ransomware. We'll build backups of environments, various environments, using that technology. And we then use that to train the CyberSense machine learning algorithms. So it's all trained within our lab. So when Buy Online came out, we downloaded Buy Online. We ran that. We were able to detect, as Joe said, we were able to detect that. So there was no additional training needed. But if we find a ransomware that we don't detect, we'll use that data to be able to retrain the machine learning algorithms. In total, we've got roughly over 5,000 different ransomware packages used for our training, and we also use data we get back from the field. So many of our customers will email their analytics results back to us. Those analytics results are then run through our machine learning algorithms, continue to train it on what ransomware is and is not, right? It's all about, okay, this backup is not infected, this backup is infected, and understanding how the data is changed. So that learning is done in our labs. We do continually update that machine learning training, as I mentioned, on an ongoing basis. We're always looking for new stuff. And we use the data we've got back from the field, from our existing customers. Every single one of their backups, that data is fed back into our machine learning algorithms for training as well. So in total, we've got roughly probably 20 to 30 million backups, good backups, bad backups of all different ransomware environments, of customer environments, that is used to train our ransomware, our machine learning algorithm.
All right. Next question. George Gasson has his hand raised. I'm going to attempt to unmute him.
Yeah, hi, I hope you're hearing me. So just quick questions, since you're talking about you're training the machine learning with any new ransomware or viruses or something. Let's say we have customers, they already have CyberSense running on-prem. What's the best way of updating their databases for CyberSense?
So we update the machine learning algorithms every GA release. We'll have a new version of the machine learning engine, the model. If we find a ransomware variant in our course of our testing between GA releases that we don't detect, and we have to adapt and retrain the machine learning algorithms. That will go out, and we'll identify that. That'll go out on our maintenance releases or an emergency release if it's warranted. We haven't had to do that to date. So CyberSense has monthly maintenance releases and quarterly, every 3 to 4 months, GA releases. The GA releases will provide any new updates to the machine learning algorithms, and then depending upon what we find out, anything new, we may issue a new machine learning algorithm in one of our maintenance releases, and that'll be identified within the release notes.
Okay.
There are some questions coming in, common questions about Hyper-V support. Can you talk about that, as well as Power Protect Data Manager PPDM support for DB2?
Okay, so for Hyper-V, currently right now we do not support Hyper-V virtual backups. That is changing. In our next release, not our 8.0 that's going to be out next week, but on the next release, we'll be adding support for, I believe, Hyper-V, Avamar, and Networker backups. So we will be adding support for Hyper-V backups, all the backups over the period of the next couple of releases. That has been a big thing for us. You caught me at a disadvantage. PPDM, data DB2. I thought we supported that. I'll have to get back to you on that one. My understanding, you have to look at the compatibility matrix. I don't have that right in front of me, to be honest with you, and I apologize, but we'll get back to you on that one.
Yeah, it says it's not available yet on the compatibility matrix for PPDM specifically. So we'll get back on that one.
We'll get back to you. If you have a backup that is not supported, I always encourage you to put an R, and if it's important for a deal, always encourage you to put an RFE into the Dell Product Manager, Prachi, and we work hand in hand with her to prioritize our feature priorities, release to release, based upon based upon customer need, based upon opportunity sizes, and so forth.
Okay. So if there's any leftover questions in the Q&A app, we will respond to these again via email. I want to thank everybody for attending today. Again, my name is Joseph Hand, Index Engines. Ed Moak, our VP of Solutions. You also heard Jim McGann on there. He is our VP of Business Development. info@indexengines.com if you have questions beyond this webinar, and we'll be happy to answer them. Thank you all for coming, and have a fantastic day. Thank you, Ed.
Okay, thanks, Joe.